In war, armies are measured not only by the number of men who march, but by the fears they plant in the minds of their enemies. During the Second World War, some of the most powerful forces on the battlefield never existed at all. They had no soldiers, no tanks, no artillery, and yet they shaped strategy, delayed offensives, and altered the course of campaigns. These were Hitler's phantom armies, divisions that lived only on maps, radio waves, and intelligence reports, but which terrified Allied commanders as if they were real. From the earliest days of the war, military planners on all sides understood one truth above all others. Information was power. Knowing where the enemy was, how strong they were, and what they planned to do could mean the difference between victory and catastrophe. But the Second World War took this struggle for information to an unprecedented level. Intelligence was no longer just about observation. It became an arena of deception, illusion, and psychological warfare. And within that arena, phantom armies emerged as one of the most effective weapons ever deployed. To the Allied intelligence officers poring over intercepted messages and aerial photographs, the German army appeared vast, complex, and constantly shifting. New divisions seemed to appear overnight. Entire corps were reported moving into threatened sectors. Fresh units were said to be forming behind the lines, preparing for counterattacks that never came. Maps were marked, plans were revised, and resources were diverted, all in response to forces that existed only as carefully constructed lies. These phantom armies did not arise by accident. They were the product of deliberate German deception strategies, amplified by Allied assumptions, fears, and the fog of war. Sometimes they were created intentionally by German intelligence. Other times, they emerged from misinterpretation, rumor, or overconfidence in flawed sources. But regardless of their origin, their impact was real. One of the key tools used to create these illusions was radio traffic. In modern war, radio communications are the nervous system of an army. Orders, reports, and requests for supplies flow constantly across the airwaves. During World War II, intelligence units on both sides devoted enormous effort to intercepting and analyzing enemy radio signals. They tracked call signs, message volumes, transmission patterns, and even the habits of individual radio operators. From this information, they attempted to reconstruct entire enemy units, where they were, how big they were, and what they were doing. The Germans understood this better than most. By the middle of the war, they realized that Allied intelligence was increasingly dependent on radio intercepts. This knowledge allowed them to manipulate what the Allies thought they were hearing. German signal units sometimes maintained radio networks for divisions that had been destroyed or withdrawn, continuing to transmit routine messages to give the impression that those units were still active. In other cases, entirely fictitious divisions were given their own radio traffic, complete with realistic patterns of communication that mimicked genuine units. These radio ghosts were convincing because they followed the rules of military behavior. They did not transmit too much or too little. Their messages reflected plausible logistical needs and operational concerns. They complained about shortages, requested reinforcements, and reported routine training exercises. To Allied analysts, these transmissions looked authentic. They were fed into intelligence summaries, marked on situation maps, and treated as hard evidence. Aerial reconnaissance, which might have exposed the truth, often failed to do so. The vast scale of the war made it impossible to photograph every road, forest, and village. Weather, camouflage, and the limits of technology created blind spots that deception planners exploited. If a radio intercept suggested a division was stationed in a certain area, and aerial photos did not conclusively prove otherwise, intelligence officers tended to err on the side of caution. After all, assuming an enemy force was real and being wrong was safer than assuming it was fake and being attacked. The result was a battlefield haunted by invisible armies. These illusions had profound consequences. Allied commanders frequently delayed advances because intelligence suggested strong German forces lay ahead. In some cases, entire offensives were postponed or rerouted based on the perceived presence of enemy units that did not exist. Supplies and reinforcements were diverted to counter threats that were nothing more than radio signals and paperwork. The problem was compounded by the way intelligence flowed through military hierarchies. Raw information was collected at the front lines or by intercept stations, then filtered, analyzed, summarized, and passed upward. At each stage, assumptions hardened into facts. A report that began as possible enemy division activity might reach a senior commander as enemy division present. Once such information was incorporated into planning, it became difficult to challenge. German deception units sometimes reinforced these illusions through physical means as well. Small groups of soldiers were instructed to move conspicuously, creating tracks, fires, and signs of activity that suggested a larger force. Vehicles were driven in circles to simulate traffic. Dummy equipment was positioned where it might be spotted by reconnaissance aircraft. When combined with radio traffic, these measures created a layered deception that was difficult to unravel. Yet not all phantom armies were the product of German planning. Some were born entirely within Allied intelligence itself. Analysts, under immense pressure and facing incomplete data, sometimes overestimated German strength simply because it seemed logical. Germany was known for its military efficiency and ability to mobilize resources quickly. When faced with ambiguous information, it was easy to assume the worst. This tendency was particularly strong during periods when the Germans appeared to be preparing major counteroffensives. In such moments, Allied intelligence often detected increased radio traffic, troop movements, or logistical activity. But these signals did not always correspond to real combat formations. Training units, replacement depots, or administrative headquarters could be mistaken for frontline divisions. Once labeled as such, they took on a life of their own in intelligence reports. The psychological impact of these phantom armies cannot be overstated. War is fought not only with weapons, but with perceptions. Allied commanders knew that underestimating the enemy could lead to disaster. Memories of early defeats, such as the fall of France, loomed large. Caution, even excessive caution, seemed prudent. Phantom armies exploited this mindset, turning fear into a strategic weapon. The phenomenon reached its peak during critical phases of the war, particularly as the Allies prepared to invade occupied Europe. The Germans, aware that a massive invasion was coming, but uncertain where it would land, attempted to create the impression of strength everywhere. By maintaining the illusion of powerful reserves and mobile divisions, they hoped to deter or delay Allied operations. In some cases, this strategy succeeded. Allied planners often believed that German forces were stronger and more flexible than they actually were. They overestimated the speed at which German divisions could redeploy and the number of units available for counterattack. These miscalculations influenced decisions at the highest levels, shaping the timing and direction of major operations. Ironically, the Germans themselves sometimes fell victim to similar illusions. Allied deception operations, most famously those surrounding the Normandy landings, created entire phantom armies that existed only in German intelligence assessments. But while Allied deceptions are well known and widely celebrated, the German phantom armies that haunted Allied planners remain far less discussed. One reason for this imbalance is that successful deception often leaves little physical evidence. Real battles leave wreckage, casualties, and captured documents. Phantom armies leave only paper trails and memories, intelligence reports, intercepted messages, and planning documents that quietly shape decisions before being forgotten or dismissed after the war. Another reason is that acknowledging the influence of phantom armies can be uncomfortable. It highlights the limitations of intelligence, the role of fear and assumption, and the ease with which even sophisticated organizations can be misled. Yet these lessons are among the most important of the war. As the conflict progressed and Allied intelligence capabilities improved, some phantom armies were eventually exposed. Patterns that once seemed convincing began to unravel under closer scrutiny. Analysts noticed inconsistencies in radio traffic, A division that had supposedly been active for months showed no signs of rotation, casualties, or resupply consistent with real combat. Aerial reconnaissance combined with ground reports failed to confirm the presence of troops where they were expected. In these moments, phantom armies faded away, quietly erased from maps and reports, but the damage had often already been done. Time had been lost. Opportunities had passed. Resources had been misallocated. By the end of the war, Allied analysts conducted extensive reviews of intelligence failures and successes. Phantom armies emerged as a recurring theme. They were cited as examples of how easily deception could take hold and how difficult it was to separate reality from illusion in modern warfare. These lessons did not fade with the end of World War II. On the contrary, they became foundational principles of Cold War intelligence. The idea that an enemy might deliberately create false forces to manipulate perceptions influenced decades of military planning. Satellite imagery, electronic surveillance, and advanced reconnaissance technologies were all developed, in part, to prevent future phantom armies from shaping strategy unchecked. Yet even with these advances, the core challenge remains. Intelligence is still an imperfect science. Information is still incomplete, ambiguous, and vulnerable to manipulation. The ghosts of World War II's phantom armies linger as a warning that the most dangerous enemy is not always the one you can see, but the one you believe exists. In the end, Hitler's phantom armies were not divisions of flesh and blood, but divisions of fear and imagination. They marched across maps, occupied planners' minds, and shaped decisions that affected millions. They remind us that in war, illusion can be as powerful as reality, and that sometimes the greatest forces are those that never truly existed at all.